We are recording.
Ready?
Yeah.
I am Halivni, sitting with Mr. Albert Ratner in Cleveland, Ohio. Today is December 4th, 2017. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What I'd like to do is to start at the beginning, if possible, and if you could tell me a little bit about, do you remember your grandparents?
Very well.
You could tell me where your grandparents were from, their names, just to get a little bit of the...
So, I had a mother and a father, obviously. My mother was born in this country in I believe it was 1904. And her parents came from Russia. They lived here in Cleveland until 1932 when they moved to California. My grandfather was, on my mother's side, a very prominent Cleveland businessman and did business with almost all non-Jewish people. He was in the cartridge business, and he did the cartridge for the department stores. I remember as a young man, people walking up to me who I didn't know and saying, if you could be half what your grandfather was, you would end up being a great man.
What were their names?
Their names were Harry and Goldie Bernstein. And my mother was one of three children. She was the middle child. My father family came from Białystok, Poland. And there's a whole story that goes with that. 9 children. The half-sister came here. She was dating a Shagets in Białystok, so they sent her out. The oldest of the children of my grandmother and grandfather, because my grandfather's first wife had died, was my uncle Charlie Kalman Ratner. He was taken out of Poland because he went to school and either sang a pro-communist song or an anti-communist song, and they decided that they would ship him out of the country because my grandmother was told somebody was going to kill him. So at the age of 12, he came to the United States, went to New York with some relatives who said, we're going to prepare you for your bar mitzvah, to which he said, if I wanted to be bar mitzvah, I would have stayed in Białystok. So he ran away from home. And he made his living selling newspapers and singing on the streets of New York. He had an unbelievably beautiful voice. He could sing in 5, 6 different languages. He ended up going into the army and ended up serving in World War I in the Panama Canal, and he was a gambler. And he was an exceptionally brilliant man, and he kept being made first sergeant, and he would gamble, and they would break him. But in the meantime, he was stashing up money. And in 1920, nobody had heard from him for a number of years. He appeared at the door of the family in Białystok and said, you're all leaving. And they didn't want to leave, because while things were very bad at that point, Białystok was always between Poland and Russia. They were leaving their country, and they had, my father and one of his brothers were of army age. And they couldn't leave, so they had to smuggle out of the country. The rest of the family, who couldn't get out of the country, my uncle somehow had become a 32nd degree Mason, which is hard to do if you're Jewish. And he went to the consulate in whatever city it was, and believe it or not, the consulate was a 32nd degree Mason. So my father and uncle, who smuggled out, came in 1920, the day that Harding was elected president. And the rest of the family came in January or later the following year, and the twin of the youngest 2 kids the boy twin died on Ellis Island, and the family came to Cleveland. So basically, we had living in Cleveland at the time that I was born. My uncle, who brought us all here, moved to Florida and actually built the first hotel in Miami Beach, believe it or not, which still exists. This was in 1936 or 37, called the Clevelander Hotel.
Really?
It's now a real hot spot in Florida. So turns out in my family, my father and my Uncle Charlie, the oldest brother, married my Aunt Till and my mother. So two brothers married two sisters. So I had double first cousins. So
how did they decide to come to Cleveland?
at that time, both my Aunt Frida, who was a half sister, came to Cleveland and married a cousin in Cleveland. In those days, you could, not a blood cousin. And my Uncle Charlie came to Cleveland because my Aunt Frida was here. And he was in business. He actually started our business and then over time moved to Florida. So our home was Cleveland. So my late sister, Ruth, who was a couple of years older than I was and who was on the original Holocaust board, she was actually, at her time, the longest serving member of the Holocaust Commission. Were raised by an American mother, very strong Jewish feelings, conservative. They left the Jewish center, the family place, because men and women couldn't sit together. And they went to what was a new Jewish center, which I still, my wife and I are members of. So I was born in 1927, and in a month we'll celebrate my 90th birthday, which is kind of mind-boggling to me. It's hard for me to understand.
Your father, his name was
Leonard,
and he was born in
Bialystok in 1896.
1896.
And he was one of 9 children.
And he came here in 1920.
He came here in 1920. So the family stuck together.
He got married in Cleveland?
Got married in Cleveland, Ohio to Lillian Bernstein. Had 2 children, my sister Ruth and myself. So that was our family background. So what happened was very closely knit family. My uncle, who started the business, went to Florida. My father, who with the family was running a couple of creameries, took over the business, and that was the forerunner of what is now a large real estate enterprise in the United States. So we were a very close family, and we spent all of the Jewish holidays together, always at my grandfather's and grandmother's house. So I was born in 1927. My grandparents both died the year that I was bar mitzvah. It was a very sad time for me, which was in 1940. My Uncle Charlie had died the year before in Florida. And that's why being 90 is so amazing to me, because by the time I was 12, I lost people who were very close to me. I thought I would make it to 15, and then 18, and then 30, and then 60. So here I am telling this story. So
where'd you live?
Where did I live?
Yeah.
So we started out, when I was born, we lived opposite the lumber yard in a 2-family house.
Where was that?
That was on St. Clair Avenue in Larchmont. Then when the Depression came, we lived in a cottage out on the lake, which became a kind of family home for all of us. Then we moved to 208th Street in Euclid, and then up to the Heights in 1934. So that was our movement. But every Saturday night, we would always go to my grandparents. And I was always very close to my grandparents, so I would go on Friday night and then Saturday. They were phenomenally unusual people. My grandmother was the daughter of a very famous rabbi by name of Kalman Koppelman. And he only lived for 40 years. But he was absolutely brilliant. And in the year I was born, the family put money together to publish some of his speeches. And I'll give you a book of some of the speeches he gave. Were absolutely brilliant. And it was always thought somebody in my generation would be a Rebbe, but it didn't turn out that that was it. So my earliest years, we would go every Saturday, all the kids would get together, and it was a depression. So this was in 1932, I was 5 years old. And we'd go every Saturday, the kids would come first, and then we would eat, and then the parents would come later. We'd eat together. It was always milchiks. And then the parents would come, then the kids were taken home, and the parents would stay and play cards, and that continued till 20 years after I was married. But we always spent all the Jewish holidays together, and we still do. So we have my wife, I lost my first wife, but both my first wife and second wife, we've always had one of the holidays, so Passover is one of them. In the good old days, our house wasn't big enough, so my wife had somebody who had a moving van company. He'd take our furniture out, and then when the Seder was over, he'd bring the furniture back in. We now do it at the Ritz-Carlton in Cleveland. We can have up to 150 people that come from all over the country to celebrate the family Seder. So when we were kids, we always got together at my grandmother and grandfather's house. My grandfather, in the old country, we had a damshtu, we had a device that could make cloth, and that's how the family lived. My father came to this country. He started out working in a factory that did that, but my grandfather was always reading and always studying. My grandmother was like the ever-ready battery. She just kept going and going and going. And each one of the kids was special. When we went to Sunday school, which was in the Jewish neighborhood, so we came from the Heights, all of us, to the neighborhood. After Sunday school, we would go to her house. It was the first McDonald's. But she didn't make hamburgers, she made cutlets. And she made them all the way from steak tartare, which she didn't understand at all, to well done. Well, my grandmother knew that I did not like milchiks. So she would take me into the anteroom and give me fleshik, salami, corned beef. I now have 12 stents, and I'm on my third defibrillator. So my grandmother's never far away from me. What was interesting about my grandmother, which really is the start of the story as it relates to Israel, it was a depression. Money was hard to get. The kids always came on Saturday, and it was Shabbos. She wouldn't touch money, but she would open her purse. I'd usually stay overnight, then the other kids would come. She'd point to a nickel or a dime, what we could take to go to the Liberty Theater. But when we were alone from Friday night, went to shul Saturday morning with my grandfather, she had a little anteroom off of the kitchen. And the anteroom was the thing I loved the most, which was the salami. And the salami hung in the anteroom. And beneath the salami were 3 pushkas, 3 donation boxes. And we had a routine. I could not have a piece of salami if I didn't put money in the pushka. But of course, I didn't have any money to put in the pushka. But my grandmother would give me a penny. And our routine is nish geld, nish salami. You don't put money in the box. So we'd go through the routine. Was is das box. And she was very hard of hearing. We had an African-American girl that helped us in the house, and myself. We were the only 2 she could understand. For some reason, we talked a combination. I didn't know a lot of Yiddish, but I knew enough. So was is das. Oh, das That is for the alte home, the old home. For what do we have in old home? I'm 8, 9 years old. Because people get older, they need kosher food, and that's where they go, but you will never put me there. I will live with you. Was ist das? That's for Mount Sinai Hospital. Was ist Mount Sinai Hospital? It's a Jewish hospital because you can never get into another hospital. They won't let Jewish people become doctors. So when you become a doctor, we have a hospital that you can go to, and I can go and I can get kosher food. So that was easy enough to understand. Then it was a little blue and white box. And he says, was ist das? Das is for Palestine. Was is Palestine? Well, I knew what Palestine was because in those days, in Sunday school, the Jewish National Fund, Karen, how you saw it, had trees. And if you came and you brought a penny, you would get a leaf. So it would go each week, and we all had our own little tree, and would give a penny and would get a leaf for the penny. So I knew what it was, but I said, was ist Palestine? Well, our homeland. Was ist a homeland? Wie viel Jahre, how many years, nicht a homeland? She said, 2,000 years, 2,000 years. I says, Bobby, was ist das a story? 2,000 Jahre, nicht a homeland, and you're telling me that we're going to have a homeland? She says, you will have a homeland. And that was why when I lived to see that homeland, it meant so much to me. Because that's why we ended up with one. Because the people through everything we went through, they never forgot. And they probably never forgot primarily because they were not allowed to forget. My late wife and I studied Torah with Rabbi Paperman, the Telzi Yeshiva, who was a phenomenal fellow for 12 years. And he said to us, Hitler had made a mistake. If he opened up the Jewish country, the non-Jewish country, the Jews, they all would have assimilated. But whatever the reason is. So I used to go to my grandmother's every Saturday, and I would sometimes turn the radio. I'd sit in the car outside. It was Shabbos, and I'd listen. And I heard a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler speaking. And I heard him shrine. He sounded terrific to me. They took away the Sudetenland. They did all these bad things. And I went to my grandma. I said, I heard this tremendous guy. She started to explain to me he really wasn't so tremendous. So from that period of time on, as I was growing up, that was what my background was. My Uncle Charlie opened the hotel in 1936. My sister and I took the train down for the open. We remember that well. And he died, and then my grandparents died, which was a very sad time. My Uncle Max, who was the youngest after the twin had died, the youngest of the brothers, in 1932, he had gotten his law degree, and we were in the lumber business, and business was not very good. So he decided he'd take a trip around the world, and he did. He was in Egypt, and the banks closed, so he got him some money, but he went to Germany. And when he was in Germany, he took pictures.
What year is this?
1932 or 33. And they confiscated his camera. But he did save some pictures of the stores and Juden, the whole business. So we had an idea. I mean, everybody had an idea something was going on in Germany. My mother became active in the community way before my father did. My mother was both in the business and in the community, and my mother led a drive to pay off the temple mortgage. I remember holding my sister's hand at the old Jewish Center upstairs in the ballroom when they announced that two ladies, Judge Stasel and my mother, had gone around to collect enough money to pay off the more. So my mother was very much involved in Jewish stuff. My father told us all of the stories of what was like and what a pogrom was like and how they had to go to sell the cloth, and we knew all of that stuff. But as the world started to change and we're getting closer to war, my father, with much greater intensity, had great concern. Listened to the radio all the time. And I remember as a kid when Poland was invaded on September 1st, 1939. And my father, from that point on, listened to the radio all the time, day and night. He would just listen to what was happening with the war. And we didn't have a lot of money. The first pledge my father gave to the welfare was $5. And we used to list who gave what to the welfare. So it was a depression. We had our business. We did not suffer in the depression. But what was very obvious to me in growing up was that we weren't exactly first-class citizens. So I grew up understanding that if I wanted to be president of my class, I had to be better than anybody else. That there were places I wasn't going to live. That if I was going to be a doctor, I'd be restricted, that I wouldn't be with a big company. And when we lived, this would have been in 27 and 7. This would have been in 34. And about 1933, I was coming home from school. And it was a non-Jewish neighborhood. My dad was a builder, built a house. We moved into the street. A couple kids came over, took a rock and hit me in the head, and my family took me to the hospital. They sewed me up. And I remember that night my parents said, "We're not going to live here anymore. We're going to move to the Heights." So we were one of the first new houses on our street. We had lumber in the lumber yard. My father said, "It doesn't do any good sitting there. I'll put it in the house at least. We'll live somewhere." So we moved up to the Heights.
Where'd you live?
We lived on Shannon Road, off of Taylor. My sister and I, we said to my mother, "We need a bus." So my mother took us to the RTA, the Transit Authority, and said, "My two children think we need a bus. What do they do?" I said, "Well, you go around and you get a petition." So that's how my sister and I learned how you get a bus. That was, our parents were always great.
Where in Shannon? Near Taylor?
Yeah, it was on Taylor Road. So Shannon is next to Severin's estate. And then there's Severin, Shannon, Berkeley, Bendemer. That whole street.
I grew up in Bendemer.
Yeah, so it's just the same hood. So I went to Boulevard Elementary School, Roosevelt Junior High School, and Heights High School. That was my career path. But I remember at some point, 35, 36, my mother bought us a set of encyclopedias. And my mother came home my dad came home from work that night, and we were sitting on the floor with the encyclopedias. My dad sat down and said, "You know, I've never learned the Star-Spangled Banner. Teach me the Star-Spangled Banner." So it's like yesterday, I can picture us sitting on the floor and teaching my dad the Star-Spangled Banner. So it was a very unusual life, because this fiercely American mother with very strong Jewish feelings, and this brilliant European guy who went to high school, but was not only brilliant, he was so wise. Just, it had to come from the tradition of the Rabbonim that were in the whole line of family we had. And they were just such a phenomenally paired couple for us. And the relationship is, if I needed something from my dad, I had to go to my sister. If she needed it from my mother, she would come to me and say, "Tell Mom to do this for me." So raised, brought up been in a Jewish home with very strong relatives very close together. And it turns out, I didn't find out till I was almost 75 years old, that I'm dyslexic. I never knew it. But I could never learn Hebrew. I studied the same book day after day. I couldn't learn it, and I almost flunked Latin. My mom taught I almost flunked Spanish. So I never actually learned Hebrew. I learned some Yiddish along the way. So as I was growing up, the only contact I had with non-Jewish people was in school. Boulevard, Roosevelt Heights were maybe half Jewish and half not Jewish. But our social life, we knew people in our business. So we knew the fellow who sold shingles for Celotex Company. And we had, but it was all a Jewish kind of world.
One second. Is there a glare on glasses?
I was looking at for it before, but I don't think it's. Can you look at him again?
What do you want me to do?
There's a slight glare. It's not
Okay.
occluding his eye.
Fine.
Yeah.
I thought there was maybe a glare on your from the
Oh,
glasses.
okay.
I don't know if you want to straighten your tie or not.
How's that?
Great.
So while all this is going on, the conversation among my family is what's happening in Europe.
Was there any family still left in Europe?
A lot of family. But a lot of it's gone to Canada. But we lost a lot of people. I found out later in what took place. So there was always this connection and always this conversation about what was going on. And in the 8th grade, so in the 8th grade, I was 13 years old. So it would have been 1940. The Jewish welfare in the city had been put together by German Jews, and we had a very good federation, but it was a depression, so there wasn't a lot of money. But in 1940, what they started to do, they started to collect money in the high schools, in the junior high schools. So the first involvement I had in actually collecting money for the Federation was in the 8th grade, and I headed in the 8th grade the welfare fund drive for my school. And then I did it in high school, and then I enlisted in the Army. And when I came back, which I'll get to later, that's what I did for a period of time and traveled with survivors when they started coming back to the United States. So in the 8th grade, I started out collecting money for the Jewish welfare because the Joint Distribution Committee was in business, and money was going to Europe to help Jews in Europe, and that continued on. But my life was pretty much non-Jewish friends at school, but very, very much Jewish. And when I went to high school, I ended up heading the drive-in high school. In the meantime, what was happening to our federation, the German Jews were there, but all of a sudden, the Polish Jews, the other Jewish people started getting involved in the Federation. And there was a little disconnect in the sense that the German Jews, there weren't a lot of Jews left in Germany, but there were all these Jews left in Poland and Czechoslovakia and all over. So the Federation began to change. One of the things that happened to me, and I think the year was 1944, at that point what began to happen on a national basis, a group of Jewish leaders from various cities got together. And my father, my Uncle Max, were among them. So there was a group, there was my father, Joe Meyerhoff of Baltimore, Nehemi Cohn from Washington, Jack Weiler from New York, Ben Zwick from San Francisco, and they became involved in the UJA. And they knew there was Soros. So they started going out and started getting together. 1944, my father said to me, so I was 17, my father said to me, it was December, I'm going to Washington to meet with a group of Jewish people, and I want you to go with me. So I got in a train with my father, and we went to the White House. Either the White House or the Treasury, I don't remember which. And there were 10 men and myself. And we sat down with Secretary of Treasury Morgenthau. And Morgenthau said to us, we now have evidence that Jews are being slaughtered in mass numbers. And I think that was the first time I think the gas had come into being, and they now had the ability to do what it was they wanted to do all along, which was to kill people in the thousands and the millions. And had a conversation, what can you do? What can the United States do about it? Then the war ended in 1945. So I look back at those times and I think to myself, what could we do? People can't understand, first of all, how powerless this country was. We were through the Depression. We had a Congress that was isolationist, and one of the people you ought to talk to, if you can get to him, is Morgenthau's son, who's now 98 or something. But he can really tell you stories, because Henry Morgenthau was one of the giants both then and after the war. But one of the things that he told me, that Robert told me, to give you an example of what was happening in the country at the time, was that Congress authorized the Boeing company to draw plans for a bomber. I think it was a B-17, I'm not sure which one. And it was $1 million. And they drew the plans, and Congress refused to allocate the money. So they wouldn't pay them. Very isolationist, Vandenberg, a group of people. The Japanese came to the War Department and offered $10 million. Morgenthau went to Roosevelt and said, we can't let him do this. And Roosevelt said to Morgenthau, steal the money. Take it from somewhere. We cannot let them have those plans. And they'd all be impeached today, all right? This is why I have a little different view of what you do as a government to survive than some of my other friends might have. But if you didn't live through the times, you had no ability to understand there was no army, there were no guns, there were no planes, there were no ships. At the same time, you had in the White House a lot of people who were critical of Roosevelt. In my view, he was still the greatest president that ever lived. With everything that happened, he took a country that was in a horrible depression that could have had a total revolution. And he did things that a lot of people didn't want him to do. He did Social Security. He did all of those things. He took us out of that. And he kept sending stuff to Britain illegally that kept Britain alive. And in my view, had Pearl Harbor never happened, we still wouldn't be in war, because there was no appetite whatsoever to do anything to help the people in Europe. In the meantime, some people would come here from Europe, and you'd begin to hear stories. It's a very sad time, very, very sad time. And when I look at the period of my life before there was a state of Israel, what I say to everybody is, my lifetime was, I was born, the Depression, World War II, the Holocaust, and the state of Israel. And nothing that happened after that had any effect on my thinking. Everything that I think about when I look at the Vietnam War, and everybody says, how can you be for the Vietnam War? And I said, if you saw what I saw, you could understand what happens. And my mother had taken my sister and I to a movie. This was in the early 30s. It was a movie showing the Sino-Chinese, Japanese-Chinese war, and a picture of a baby being thrown out and somebody about to catch it in a bayonet. And she said, as long as children aren't safe anywhere in the world, your children will never be safe. So it's a different time. It's the difference, the gulf between me and my kids, who are phenomenal. And I couldn't ask for better kids. But what I lived through, and you have to understand, I didn't live through it suffering. So at no time was I ever in jeopardy. In no time did I not eat. At no time was I worried I'd be homeless. None of that. But just seeing what took place. Once Poland was invaded, everything changed for my father. Because he was just intensely involved in what happened, and these were his people who were being killed. So he then became very active in the Jewish community, and he was among the leaders in the country that put together all of the programs, and there are pictures of him in the car with Ben-Gurion when they came to Cleveland, and they formed Israeli bonds. So all of this stuff, and I knew Moshe Shiret when he was Moshe Shertak, because he was in our house. I knew Golda when she was Golda Meyerson. So all of these people were the people that, and in the earliest years of Israel, when I used to go there very often, these were the people that I kind of grew up in, but they were like cousins. They were people, I remember being with Eshkol, and Eshkol saying to me that the difference between your father and my father and me is your father decided to make a stop in America, and I came direct to Israel. But you'll all be here. You'll all be in the same place. So I grew up involved in the Jewish welfare, involved in all of those things. And
when did you enlist in the Army?
So what happened is I graduated high school in 1946 in January. The war ended in 45. I thought I was always going to be in the Army. So the war ended. So I said to my parents, I want to enlist in the Army. I said, what are you going to enlist? There's no war. There's no draft. You know, my father hated guns. Just hated them. What did we do that's so bad? Look, I think I should enlist. Well, what happened was I was a very good basketball player. So I ended up getting a basketball scholarship to Western Reserve. So I graduated in January. I went to Reserve in January of 1946. So I played basketball in high school in 1946 and in college in 1946. School year ends. I come back to school in 46 at Reserve, and it's like I'm back in high school. All the GIs are coming home from the service, and I still haven't been in the Army. So I go to my mother, I say I'm enlisting. She says, you can't. First you have to go to your father before you enlist and tell him you're going to enlist, and if he doesn't die, then you can enlist. I go tell my father that I'm going to enlist in the Army. He goes to bed for a week and never told me it was all right. He didn't understand it when I was doing it. And then I went and I enlisted. So I was in the Army from 1946 August to March of 48. And what did I do in the Army? They needed me so badly, I played basketball. That was my job. So in 1 year I played basketball, in 46 in high school, college, and the Army. So I was in the Army, and while I was in the Army, interestingly enough, this is when Jewish life started to change My father and Rabbi Cohn wanted to move the synagogue from the city to Euclid Heights Boulevard. And they found a location where the old Park School was. It was a private school. It was owned by Rockefeller. There were deed restrictions. So my father and the rabbi went to see Rockefeller in New York. They have a conversation, and this is Forest Hills. This was a part of Forest Hills, which was restricted. There couldn't be Jews. They sit down with Rockefeller, and Rockefeller says to them, I cannot knowingly sell this to Jewish people. They get back on the airplane and go, what does he mean he can't knowingly sell it? So they get an Irish broker, and they go in, and they buy the land. And there's a deed restriction. And they go in to try to get it zoned. I was in the Army at the time. And Mayor Kane, who was the mayor and a good friend of mine, we don't want this. There's a deed restrict, and it was a terrible fight. I remember writing a letter to the mayor, asking him, I was good enough to be your friend and play basketball, and now I'm no good anymore. We had a terrible fight to get that done. And in the earliest years of my business, all these deed restrictions, advanced swearingens, you couldn't live anywhere. Compared to the Holocaust, it was nothing.
The restrictions were all about Jews.
Jews, Catholics, blacks. I mean, the good thing about a minority is you're never alone. You're either more persecuted or you're less persecuted. You know, in a way, Jewish is better than black, because I look at you and you look to me Jewish, but you could be Slovenian, you could be other things. If you're black, you're black. But being Jewish could be bad enough for what you were. So that was really the background. The interesting thing is the way this happened to my life is I get out of the Army in 1948. And I go back to my high school. When I left my high school, I was the BMOC, the biggest man on campus. I get back to my high school. And what I decided to do, I wasn't starting school. I didn't want to go back to college. I wanted to come into business. My father says, no, you're going to college. I said, Dad, I can't learn anything about the lumber business. About 2 weeks later, he brings me a green book from Michigan State. Oh, they have a course in lumber merchandising. I said, Dad, you had to fund the school. There's no such thing. So I go back to Cleveland. I'm going to go to Western Reserve for a period of time. And that's when I want to quit. And he gets me the book from Michigan State. So I had nothing to do between March of 48 and when school started. That was the year the Indians won the pennant. So I had a good shot, the World Series, to go to see some games. But I took 2 jobs. I headed the high schools for collecting money for the Jewish welfare. So that was one job I took. Then the other job I took was I started travel for the UJA with survivors. So it'd call me up and say, we have a survivor, we're going to go to Detroit, you go with them. So the first thing that happens is I'm doing this high school stuff, and I call all the high school kids together, and we're sitting in a JCC facility, and I'm giving a speech. There's a girl sitting in the front row in a white sweater. She's not listening to a word I say. And I'm really aggravated. And I stop my speech, and I look at her and I say, you in the white sweater, you haven't heard a word I said. She didn't look up, she kept knitting, and repeated every word I said verbatim. That turned out to be my wife, my late wife now, my wife Faye. So this is intertwined in my life almost with everything I was doing. So I was doing that with a high school group, and I was traveling with the survivors. And there were 2 things that came out of that. The first thing was I found that hard when I was a kid to understand how we got and other people didn't. But the experience of going with different people and hearing their stories. So you'd go with somebody that said we lived in Germany, but we weren't Jewish, we were German. But it didn't matter, they killed us anyhow. To the most religious people that said to me it was God's will. So it made me wonder, how did we get out? Now, Orthodox Jews would say, Rabbi Gifter, who was a part of what people we studied with, said, you won't understand it, it's God's will. I don't believe that. I don't believe that if there is a God, and I think there well could be, I can't tell you there is or there isn't, that could not be his desire. And I've always had in my lifetime a terrible dilemma as to whether or not we should have been given free will. It's always been for me a question that I've dabbled with my whole life, because cows don't kill cows. Only people kill people. So the second thing that came out of it was the story had to be told. That what would happen 20 years from now, 50 years, 100 years from now, the story had to be told. So I started talking to people about the fact the story had to be told. But nobody would talk about what happened. Now, at the same time as this was happening, during the war, the lumber business was a very slow kind of business because all the timber went somewhere else. Our business started to grow. So my father, my Uncle Max, my Uncle Harry started to sign for people. So for a part of my life, I was working with survivors in boxcars unloading lumber, because they came over here. A lot of them became very big builders. A lot of them established their life.
Moti is on the phone.
Say it again?
Moti is on the phone. The man from Surgical Theater.
So ask him to tell him there's a friend of my daughter's who has pancreatic cancer.
Okay.
What hospital near Washington has his system
Okay.
so they can be operated on? Then I'll talk to him later.
Okay. And the Fernasiak family has just arrived since they shut off the recording device. You got 5 minutes that we had planned.
Okay.
Okay.
So what happened at that period of time was nobody would talk. But there was always within me the fact that this story had to be told. What also happened at that time was when we found out in the community the Holocaust had happened, everything changed within the community. And it began to be taken over by the immigrant Jews, the people who had come in later, and the German Jews were always a part of it, but the people who had lost people. So it happened in Cleveland in the Depression in 1939. The largest gift was $5,000. Starting in 1946, when people found out what happened, a group of people got together and gave $10,000. When the State of Israel came into being, it was a group gave $25,000, and then it kept going up. When I came out in 1948, I spent time in the lumber yard. One day my father says, this was in April of 48, or maybe March of 48. It had to be April because that's when I got out of the Army. Said, there's a guy by the name of either Rosenbaum or Rosenbluth that wants to see me. I want you to sit with us. So, sit with Rosenbluth. Says, I'm a representative of the State of Israel to be formed. No? So why are you here? We don't have any money, so we need money. But we don't want a gift. We'll pay you back. And I'm going around the country to collect money, but we'll pay you back. So my father says, how much money do you want? He says, I want $25,000. So my father didn't have $25,000. He says, all right, I'll go to the bank and I'll give you $25,000. And Rosenbluth said, here's a note from the Jewish agency, or it was a state of it, whatever it was, to be formed. And we give him the $25,000 with interest. So the State of Israel gets formed. The next day in the mail comes a check with interest. $25,007. I give the check to my father. I am not going to take a check from the State of Israel. So I write a note saying, please send me a check for $25,000. My father won't take interest. I get a letter back. We're a state. We pay interest. So it went on for 6 months. Finally wrote him a letter, said, would you please give me 2 checks? One for $25,000 and one for $7.25. I gave my father the $25,000 and I ripped up the check. So one of the things I remember as a kid, when I got out of the Army in 48, was Chaim Weitzman came here. And we were at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And I remember it because the meat we were eating, I couldn't understand it, was from a cow called Prince Henry IV. But it was a state, this was a big deal. But I was selected, obviously, because of my father, I'd been in the service, to hand a check to Weitzman for $1 million, which was the money we had collected from what took place. So the rest of my life was, I was an original member of the Jewish agency when it was reconvened. I remember sitting there with a fellow by the name of Chilowitz, who manufactured hankies, and we were sitting there saying, why are we doing this in Israel? We should be doing it in the United States. But nobody from Washington ever called me to sit down to do the things that I was able to do with the United States. So there's a history of this. You ought to interview my cousin Chuck, who just left as the head of the Jewish agency. My Uncle Max was the founder of the American-Israeli Chamber of Commerce. We had business. I could tell you stories about businesses. Almost all of them lost money because we made them all with our heart. We built the Sharon Hotel. We bought Weitzman's Fruitrum Chemical, his perfume business, fragrance business, that became the American Electrochemical Company. So it just goes on and on and on. And people in my family have been the head of bonds and the head of this and the head of that. My career has changed a lot because what's happened, I've always remembered that what destroyed us was self-hatred. And I always had a problem. I always believed that the best friend is someone who tells you the truth. And that the problem with the American Jewish community leadership was that we weren't the best friend we could be for Israel. Because we always, whatever they did was fine. And they have a right. I'm a strong believer. I don't live there. They have the right to make the decisions. But I was in line to be the head of the UJA. Could have been the Jewish agency. And I just said, I can't do it because the world has changed and the community has changed. In my father's day, you had people that had things in common. And the most important thing was survival and the cause. And the analogy I would give, I do a lot of work in the African American community, and one of my friends said to me, it was much easier to get things done when people were being hung, when blacks were being lynched, and now it's much harder to get people to do things. In my view, what's happened to us over time is we don't understand our place in the world. And while we may be here today, I had a heart attack in 1997. And I had gone to Yad Vashem. And every time I'd go, and have not been to Israel since, because I have 12 stents, I have this defibrillators. And the last thing that I saw leaving Yad Vashem was a history of German Jews. That when they finally got into the ghetto, they had the best Jewish community they ever had. And I went to Italy the next day. I had a heart attack, and I was in the ambulance being taken to the hospital. I thought to myself, how do we stop that from happening to us? We don't understand what's really going on. And I look at what's going on in Israel now, and it's very troublesome to me. Very troublesome. I look at some of the, first of all, the issue of the homeland is not an issue. We need a homeland. How we treat other people, to me, is an issue. That there are Jewish values, and I'm not sure they're being carried out, and the self-hatred of Orthodox and conservative reform will overcome it, but my father always believed you had to make peace. That there's no way over a long period of time. We're only 70 years old. That's a blink of an eye. And so I have a lot of thoughts that go through my mind. So I unfortunately I can go on for...
Can I ask you a couple more quick questions?
Sure.
Do you remember November 29th, 1947, the UN vote?
Yes. So where was I? I was sitting in a car on Mayfield Road, waiting to go in to a sorority meeting to ask them to have a dance to collect money for Israel. And I was listening on the radio to Abba Hillel Silver, who was a dear friend of my father's, giving his speech before the United Nations, and them saying there will be a state of Israel. And I walked in the sorority, and I passed this spot all the time. I mention it to my wife every time we pass. I remember saying to them, there was an announcement, there will be a state of Israel. I don't fully understand what it means, but I know it's good. We went, my father called me in the 5th day of the 7-day war. We were going to Israel and Greece, maybe the 2nd day. We went to Greece instead of Israel. My father called me, said, bring your wife and the 2 kids. This was the 6th day of the 7th day war, and we flew into Israel. And we went to Rebecca's tomb. We went to the tombs of the patriarchs, and we held hands. We're probably among the first Jewish people in 1,000 years that walked up those steps to those tombs. And we went to Rachel's tomb, and it was an Orthodox minyan, and our guide said to my wife, you can't go in and you're a woman. And she said, I'm a Jew. And in the middle of their davening, she walked into Rachel's tomb, which was a total mess. Of course, Mendy Klein of Cleveland has not fixed it up, so it's a different... Yes, I remember that very, very well.
Was your father involved in anything, in other aspects besides the raising money for
Oh, he was in everything. So in every university there's a building, and everything that took place in Israel, and in the DP camps, and taking people out. This was his life. This was what he did.
I interviewed somebody in New York last week named Stephen Stolman. He sent regards to you. His father, he's a little bit younger than you, but his father owned a lumber yard in New York.
Uh-huh.
And they were involved in a story where they were shipping the Haganah.
Right.
It had them shipping weapons from
with the
their
lumber.
pier and with the lumber.
Yeah. So there are all kinds of stories like that. People would come to us, would give them cash. The Soviet, this is fascinating, Soviet Jewry movement started in the country, here, in the world, with Abe Silverstein, who was at NASA, who would go to conventions and found people weren't there from last year of space people. He got together with my father. And what happened was they made a deal that they could buy people out. But how do you buy people out? None of it was legal. So they found a way to buy people out. And that was the start of the Soviet movement. So,
My grandfather, Moish Davis, was involved in Hashomer Hadati. And he told me a story when he passed away 10 years ago already. But he told me a story about when he was in high school, and they wanted to build a summer camp for Hashomer Hadati. And he was the one who went down to meet your father and told him what they wanted to do. And he said, your father picked up the phone, called down and said, get a truck, load it up with whatever these boys wanted.
yeah.
And that's how they
So the West Side Jewish Synagogue, Jewish Center, came about because we had all the NASA people. And they had no place for a synagogue. I just gave them some money. They're just refixing the synagogue. So it's interesting because I'm going to have my 90th birthday in a month or so, and as I look back at my life, I have been the bridge between really the greatest generation. I mean, I didn't live all the generations, but a phenomenal generation in the new world. And life goes on, but just to have been privileged. We started out talking about my grandmother and my grandfather, but just to be privileged to be in the presence of those kind of people, not only my family. It was a different world, and to live in the two worlds. People don't understand how transient life is. My wife was killed in an automobile accident, and Rabbi Cohn started his speech by saying, we live on to life, we hang on to life with our fingernails. And we don't understand that. We think, it's the old story. We were born on third base and we think we hit a triple. You earn everything you get. We don't understand it. We don't understand it. It's not about us, but it is what it is. And what I have always said to people is, I'm the guy that missed everything. I missed the worst of the Depression. I missed the war. All of the things that could have done me in. When I enlisted, my father was so upset. I got married in 1950. I had enlisted in the regular army, so I didn't have to go to the Korean War. I mean, the whole thing, my father said, life is a cholam, it's a dream. It's a dream, it's not reality.
Last question. Why do you think it's important, or why do you think it would be important for people to know about the role that American Jews played in the founding of the State of Israel?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. I think the most important reason is that those Santa Ana, those who forget history are forced to relive it. That's one thing. The second thing is that it's more important for the American Jews to understand it than the Israeli Jews, in my view, to understand, because there is a disconnect. We have one of the children in my marriage, I've been married 37 years, the second time around, is a fellow was a boy, now a girl by name of Jennifer Pritzker. Jennifer started a military museum and Archives in Chicago. And it's the role, he served in the Army, he ended up a colonel. It's a role of civilian in the military. We have a very different military than everybody else. Ours is a volunteer civil one. And he gives a prize every year to the outstanding book on war. You understand that history isn't history. History is who we are, is what makes us up. And the problem is, Shoah is doing a great thing. I was honored last year by the Maltz Museum, and the bulk of the money went to building this new feature in which you can take a Holocaust survivor and you can take his picture, you think he's there, and ask him questions. So you can have Lincoln's giving you the, it's just, there are all kinds of things. We don't appreciate history, and we don't spend a lot of time worrying about it. And as we become less religious as people, we, in a sense, disrespect it. And we disrespect it as its own parallel. We have to remember history is written by the victors. Had Hitler won the war, somebody else would have been talking to somebody else about what a great thing they had done for what they did. When the Wannsee Conference took place, and Eichmann called everybody together, if you go through the list of countries, they listed every country and the number of Jews. England, there were 120,000. One of the places that was listed was Bialystok. It wasn't a country, it's a city. But one of the families in Cleveland, you also should talk to Maury Weiss, who was the president of American Greetings, who was a kid in Czechoslovakia and raised by a Catholic family, very prominent Orthodox Jewish family. When we were going to Poland to visit the camps, and I was on the board of American Greetings, Irving Stone was the son of the founder of the company, Jacob Saperstein. And I went to Irving and said, join us, we're going to Israel. And he says, I have to ask my father. He was maybe 70 years old at the time. And I went to see his father, Jacob, and he says, Albert, Bialystok is gone. There is no Bialystok. Irving cannot go, and you cannot go either. So what kind of Michigas is that? So my father had just died. It was 1974. I had just had back surgery. We go to Bialystok. On the way back, the car overturns, we almost get killed. We get on the airplane, my cousin Chucky faints. We go to Auschwitz, walking out to the tarmac, my wife falls and breaks her hip. We put her on a plane, we go to Romania. And I thought the world was coming to an end. And I remember leaving Auschwitz and we were singing so they would know that they hadn't killed all the Jews. We take for granted what we have. And it's too bad, but it is what it is, all right? I'm not an unhappy person. I'm a very happy person, but whoever you are, you do have to spend time thinking. And I'll give you the book by my relative. I'm not sure if he looked at me today, he'd be so happy with what happened, but that's all, every generation is, that's what it is.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. I was pleased to do it.
My grandfather
What years was he in?
I'm trying to remember, but it would have been also this 46, 47, I'm
Yeah,
guessing.
it was after the.
He was, because he was born November 1927.
Yeah, so I was born December 1927.
And his stories.
So he just missed.
Yeah, and his stories are the same. He has all these stories about playing baseball, and how he was out in Washington State, and that's where the base was, and he was the starting shortstop for the team, and they would go play. They would go around playing baseball.
At the different camps, that's what, yeah.
And he would go to, sometimes he would go to Seattle, and there was a minor league team there, the Seattle Pilots, and they would go play over the weekend in
Sure.
Seattle. So he said when he did that, then he was able to go to shul, because there was a Jewish community
sure,
there,
and-
and it would get, he'd actually get, and that was his army experience.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.